And this is part of our Young Professionals series. So welcome if that is you. Just as a quick get to know the audience a little bit, because this will be an interactive conversation. If you can just raise your hand if you have attended an event with us in the past month. A little raise of hands. Who are our new folks? Who's joining us for the first time? All right, seeing some people. Welcome back, Daniel, Chica, Diamante. Wonderful. Okay, good. Well, we will be sending you some more information. We are very happy to have you with us here today, and happy to have you along for the ride for the rest of the summer. We are only halfway through this series and very much looking forward to more. It is my absolute honor to introduce Rupal Patel here today. The topic of today's conversation, and this is a conversation, we'll be keeping it casual, we'll be keeping it participatory, so please familiarize yourself with the chat box at the bottom. Drop in questions. We will be talking throughout this time here. We are still waiting for one other participant, so you might have another speaker join us soon, but it is my delight to have Rupal here today. Rupal has been volunteering with us for the past few months now, and when I think about people I know, people in my network who are excellent networkers and really good at advocating for themselves and other, Rupal is on the top of my list. So I'm very excited to have her today to talk about what advocating for yourself at work looks like, and how we can all learn ways to do that better. So to begin, just like to give Rupal a moment to introduce yourself. Who are you? You are on mute.
I was about to say something really interesting and then I realized nobody could hear me, so thank you. Thank you for that lovely intro, Linda, and hello to all of the lovely alumni who are coming in from wherever in the world you are. As Linda mentioned, I've been working with the Alumni Center for a few months now this year, and it's been absolutely fantastic. I graduated from Chicago back in 2005, so I did my master's in international relations there. Any other CIR folks in the audience, hello. And since then, I've had a slightly maybe unconventional career. So I've spent about half of my professional career working at the CIA. I left the agency about 10 years ago now, went back to school, got an MBA, and then since then have started and grown two of my own businesses. I've started doing leadership and executive coaching work with founders and other corporate leaders. And I'm currently working on a book called From CIA to CEO, which is a distillation of all of the lessons that I've learned about leadership, resilience, mental toughness, advocacy from this slightly non-traditional career and all of the work I've done in the field, advising generals, with, again, the advisory work I do for corporate leaders and executives. So that's a bit about me, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. As Linda said, it is definitely a conversation. Don't want to be speaking at you guys. So yeah, please do get as participatory as you possibly can, and I'll do my best to answer as best as I can.
Great, thank you. And how about you just kick us off? What does self-advocacy mean to you? How do you define that?
Yeah, very simply, it's finding and using your voice about the things you care about. So can be many things. For some of us, advocacy is advocating for others. For some of us, advocacy can be advocating for ourselves or our career progression. For some people, it's advocating for change within their organizations or for progress or causes they care about. But at its very, very core, it's about finding, owning, and harnessing your own voice to advocate for the things that you care about.
Great, thank you. And can you just share with us a story about advocating for yourself, ways that you have done that in your career?
Sure. So I know we're meant to be talking about career, but there are a couple of personal examples that I actually also want to share sort of from a non-professional setting, because I think it's really, really important. This idea of using our voices and advocating applies in all arenas of our lives. And I'm a firm believer that we are not compartmented people. So any baggage or stress that we've got in our personal lives, we of course bring it into our professional lives and vice versa. But starting with the professional example first, when I was working at the CIA, I was a young, excuse me, I was a young analyst, but very quickly was given a lot of responsibility and a lot of really, really important projects. I was working on a small team at the time that was focused on our war effort in Afghanistan. So it was fast-paced, high-pressure, constant questions that we were being asked from, all levels of the U.S. government, but also our NATO partners and our ISAF partners. And it was about, what year was it? I think it was about 3 years, or maybe even 2 years into my career. And I was, again, part of a small but powerful team. We had worked on this groundbreaking new assessment that was being presented to the President of the United States. And they were choosing 2 analysts to go and present our findings in the Oval Office. And I was really excited because it was me and basically 2 or 3 others who were spearheading this project. As I said, I was given a lot of responsibility from, very early on after having proved my competence. And it was me and this other, and sort of who became a very close friend of mine while, at work. The 2 of us were the ones who did, I would say, about 70% of the work. So we knew this project inside and out. And yet, when it came time for the higher ups to decide who was going to present the findings in the Oval Office, they skipped over both of us and they went with 2 others who were on the team, hadn't worked on the project, but because they were more senior and had a slightly more credibility in the eyes of the president and his advisors, both of us were looked over and they sent these 2 others. I was pissed, as you can imagine, because, I am that naive person who thinks the best person for the job should always get the job. Now, obviously, we don't live in a meritocracy, right? So that's not always how it works. There's politics and all this other stuff. And I remember pushing back, and not sort of forcefully, but going to my supervisor and just saying, hey, look, like, this isn't cool. Me and this other guy did all of the sort of the heavy lifting on this. At least one of us should be able to go. At that point, it was also a matter of principle. It wasn't just about me. It was also advocating for this other person. And it was like, at least take one of us if you're not going to take both of us. And it didn't work. It didn't, it was just politics, higher ups. It was my boss's boss, whoever, made the final decision. They couldn't see past the fact that we were sort of lower in, sort of the ranks effectively, and our grade wasn't as, high as it needed to be. Any of you who worked in the US Civil Service, it's sort of divided by grades. Anyway, I remember obviously being really angry, really frustrated. And it took a long, long time for me to get over that. I mean, I still, I stayed there for years and years afterwards and got to do some other exciting work, but that was one thing that to this day even sort of still rankles a little bit. But one of the ways I process this, and we can go into this in a little bit more detail if it's useful for others, I carried it for so long as almost a grudge and a resentment and a sign that oh, the world is so unfair and I'm not destined to meet the president or whatever, things we blow these things up to mean. And I realized after just, sort of time, maturity, life experience, that we get to choose what these things mean. We get to choose how we interpret or how we internalize the setbacks, the times we advocate and it doesn't work out, the times we don't advocate and get annoyed at ourselves, all of this kind of stuff. And instead of looking at it as this inevitable, oh, the world is an unjust place and I'm never going to, get what's my due and da-da-da-da-da, I sort of finally let go of all of that baggage. And I was like, I can choose for it to be something totally different. And it was literally just politics, right? It was office politics at its core, move on and, move forward kind of thing. So yeah, so that's probably the biggest, the biggest example I can say from my professional career and sort of how I processed it, years later.
I love that. That's a great story for so many reasons. some threads I want to pick up on there.
Yeah.
You talked a lot about this process of the advocacy and how the process can be different than the outcome. In that example, you didn't get the outcome you wanted, but you were able to internalize that or process that not as a failure. Can you talk a little bit more about the difference of self-advocacy as an outcome versus as a process?
Yeah, I think for me, the process is just doing right by yourself and feeling like you weren't just a passive bystander in your life or in your career, and you didn't clam up or shut up when you had something really important to say. And as long as you present yourself and show up for yourself as professionally and as sort of calmly as you possibly can, it's sort of that annoying Zen thing or Buddhist thing about having to detach yourself from the outcomes, because we can only control how we handle the situation. We can't control other people. I'll give you another quick example from my time at the agency. I had, it was as we grew as a team, sort of an example of how I didn't like the way I showed up for myself or advocated for myself. So, as our team grew, we had different sort of layers of leadership that was added, et cetera, and it sort of became this sort of hybrid and like network of lots of different teams working together. And at one point, again, relatively early on in my career, we did a lot of just sort of social things to blow off steam. We were all working long hours pretty consistently, and we would pretty much look for any excuse to just take a break and blow off steam and celebrate stuff, right? So I remember very vividly one time, one of our sort of mid-level bosses was leaving. He wasn't my direct boss, but I had worked with him previously, and he was part of this bigger sort of team. And I was pitching in to help plan his going away party. And I remember my boss at the time calling me into his office right in the face, basically saying, and actually not basically, what his verbatim words were, it's raising a few eyebrows that you're helping plan his going away party. And at the time I was like so taken aback, because what the hell? I mean, like, how risque is it that I was ordering crudité and like soft drinks? You know what I mean? Like, what eyebrows were being raised about what? And I remember in that moment climbing up and thinking, like, doing that thing that many of us do, is like, oh, did I do something wrong? Like, and I remember I apologized. I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, should I not have been doing this? And I remember just, sometimes you feel something isn't right, but you can't really put your finger on it until you get away from that situation. And I remember going home and thinking, what the F was he insinuating by saying it was raising a few eyebrows? There's very little ways that you can interpret that phrase to mean anything other than he thought it was something inappropriate for the workplace, right? And I was like, excuse my language, but fuck you. And it was because I had, when I was out of that scenario, all of the fury and like what exactly had transpired finally started to sink in. And I was like, that is not cool. And I remember beating myself up about it, being like, why didn't you stand up for yourself? Why didn't you call him out in the moment and be like, that, what exactly are you insinuating here? But I didn't, like so many of us, perhaps we freeze and we know we should say something, or we wish we had responded in a different way and we didn't. And then after like it was literally a couple of days of just being like angry at myself and the situation, I finally, after the fact, went back and I was like, hey, we need to have a talk about this. You're my boss. We're going to need to work together for the foreseeable future. This is not cool. And he was mortified. Not that I confronted him, but the way he behaved. And he knew it was something he had to apologize for. But it was one of those things where in the moment I was so angry at him, but more angry at myself for not speaking up, and also letting that much time elapse where all I was doing was stewing about it and fuming about how I clammed up. So I think sort of from those two examples, for me, it really is about just showing up for yourself first and foremost, and then perhaps depending on what you care about, for others, for causes, for change, for progress, etc. But I think for all of us, we can probably point to maybe many, or hopefully only a few instances where we didn't actually stand up for ourselves, and that's sort of the type of advocacy that can also become easier to do with practice and with habits.
You said two of my favorite words, which are practice and habit. So we're definitely going to dive into some ways that, folks on the line here can
Yeah.
How do you practice that? What do those habits look like? But I want to pick on something you said, about that most recent example.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing is that it is a case of it is better to be late than to not do it at all. And that if you are a person who, if you have identified a moment where you didn't advocate for yourself, or you felt that discomfort, you felt slighted, you felt like something was wrong, that you can, if you need, and part of that practice is to take the time you need to reflect, plan, strategize, and then act.
Yes.
Can you talk more about how you might be able to make that a practice, or how can people practice this
Yeah.
self-advocacy?
So I think one of the easiest things, at least that I've sort of developed for myself, is to just have more difficult conversations more often. And again, this ties back to some of the things that I had mentioned earlier on, is that, like, there are things in our personal lives with our friends, our parents, our partners, sometimes our kids, whatever it is, where again, we sort of clam up, or we sort of internalize things, we stew, we fume, we build up resentment instead of letting these things out or having a discussion, because it feels awkward, it feels uncomfortable, it feels like, I don't want to ambush anybody, or I don't want to rock the boat. And so I would just say, start practicing even in small ways, just like having difficult, awkward conversations, because after a while, they don't necessarily stop being awkward, but your ability to address them becomes that much easier. And it is like most things, it is like a muscle that gets stronger as you develop it and as you do it more often. And then the good thing about it is, you can start in small ways. So, I don't know, if your friend sort of jilted you on a bill when you guys went out to dinner or something, and you sort of were still annoyed about it, maybe you bring it up the next time in like a light and, sort of jokey way, and then you build up from that to slightly more like bigger, more important things. And then it just becomes something else that you do. It's not always easy, and I think especially for women, we don't like to, often it's women are the ones who are, encouraged to just play nice and go along and not rock the boat and all of that kind of stuff. And again, we internalize these messages, and so not only do we feel weird about making, any sort of having any difficult conversations, but on the receiving end, sometimes it's perceived as like, oh, wait a second, like, who is this woman, why is she getting all uppity, why is she bringing up old shit, like, it already happened, like, move on and get over it, kind of thing. And so we have to deal with this additional layer of like, it's awkward for us, but it's also, when we do advocate, when we do use our voices in a powerful way, people don't always respond to it in the way that, in a sort of an equitable way. So I think just practice, start small, keep it low stakes. You can even, like, I don't know, I mean, this isn't a difficult conversation, but it is sort of practicing slightly awkward conversations. Like, when you're taking out your next broadband plan, maybe you negotiate the rate on it, and it's an awkward conversation, but it gets you practicing again in a low stakes way. You don't know the person on the other end of the line, so it doesn't matter if they get insulted, but you start to develop a comfort with like awkward silences, people saying no, all of that kind of stuff. And then you can sort of graduate to the bigger, more, important, meaningful conversations that you need to have. It's not like a straight line thing, but I think we all need to just practice. And like I said, keep it small and low stakes to begin with.
I love that. I love that. Please use ComEd to help you negotiate advocating for yourself. But you mentioned that this phrase, the stakes of advocacy, and I think that's a really important, especially you the first story you shared with us was about speaking to the president of the United States, which I think a lot of people in this line are not going to have those types of stakes.
No.
But to your point, remembering that it is the spectrum, there are low stakes, and just as if you were strength training, start with the baby weights and you can work your way up. Can you give us some more examples, or talk us through some ways that you identify opportunities to practice this self-advocacy? Like, I think negotiating with service providers is really helpful, even just with your friends, maybe in like a personal context, the bill, like those are some really good examples. Can you give us more ways?
Yeah, so I'll give another sort of personal example. I think so. One of the questions you asked there was also like, how can we start identifying opportunities? I think we all know it. For me, I feel it in my throat, like when it starts to clam up, or like I can feel my heart starting to race when I'm, confronted with a situation where it's like, oh, I'm going to have to say something, or I should say something. So, first and foremost, start tuning into that sort of intuition. But secondly, I think we can anticipate some of these conversations. If we know, for example, that we're coming up for promotion, or we're having, a big review at work, or a conference, or a presentation, or some of these things, or that we want to put ourselves forward to be a speaker at a conference or something like that, we can anticipate some things. And so, it's like thinking about, well, what is going to in the next, I don't know, week or 2 weeks, whatever, what are the events, what are the things at work, what are the things at home that are coming up, and how do I feel about what I have been asked to do or not asked to do. So again, from a very personal sort of perspective, one of the difficult well, I won't put it in quotes, it was a difficult conversation. A difficult conversation I had was around the time when I was pregnant with my first child. I know that in most cases, not always, but it tends to have a bigger impact emotionally, physically, mentally, sort of socially on women than it does on men. And that's partly because of expectations and socialization and all of these other sort of big factors that we all sort of just know about. And I knew for myself, because I am someone who really, really cares about my fitness, my strength, sort of my body. And I knew that that was going to effectively sort of take a hit. I don't mean to sort of put it that way, because obviously having the ability to have a child is an amazing gift. But for those of us who like to stay strong and fit, we have to tone things down a little bit. It doesn't mean you stop exercising, but there was lots of changes and emotional changes, physical changes that I just did not like. And I remember already, a few months into my pregnancy, getting really resentful of my husband, who SOB that he was at the time was going through this cut where he was like slimming down, and it felt like every pound I was putting on or every pound he was taking off, I was putting on, right? And I started to feel this resentment even just relatively early in my pregnancy. And I had this conversation with him where I was like, look, like I feel gross. Like I had easy pregnancies. I'm very thankful for that, but they were not fun physically. And I remember saying to him, I was like, when this child comes out, me getting back my fitness and my strength is as much your responsibility as it is mine. So that might mean you watch the baby. It might mean you and I go for runs together, because I also am terrible at self-motivating. So I need someone to help push me. I was like, but this is on you as much as it's on me, because I'm taking all of the burden of growing and sort of creating this child. We need to split this equitably. And we've had so many conversations sort of along that vein in my marriage, because I don't want to resent my husband. I don't want to resent my kids. I don't want to resent anybody in my life, right? So I think that's another sort of a signal that we should all tune into, is like when we start feeling the resentment bubble up, whether it's in a personal setting or in a professional setting, that's, I think, our bodies telling us, and our sort of emotions, our brains, whatever it is, telling us like we feel in some ways underrepresented or underappreciated, or so whatever it is. And this is an opportunity for us to start having some of those difficult conversations, so that we can get to, it doesn't mean that the other person is always going to say yes. That request to my husband very well could have been met with, well, tough luck, that's on you. And then that's a different conversation to take from there. But at least you give the other person an opportunity to also show up for you and what you care about and what you need in the moment.
That's a great example. And it sounds like, before you even sounds like, based on the story you just told, step 2 is advocating for yourself. But step 1 is knowing what you want and how to articulate that. But you really have to start there first.
Exactly. And I think it's and that thing of like tuning into yourself. And resentment is a great sort of, I think, a great signal for many of us. Or just, like I said, some of us have bodily reactions. Our hearts start to race. We hear someone say something, or our boss, sort of passes us up for something. And like we have physical reactions to these things. So start to tune into what our bodies are telling us and what our emotions are telling us, without getting, sort of unprofessional and ranting and raving, but start tuning into it, and then question, okay, well, why is this coming up? Where is this resentment coming up? Where is this emotion coming from? Whatever else it is. And then maybe try to sort of give it a bit of space, a bit of time, interrogate it a little bit, so you're not always feeling like you're running around screaming into the wind. But yeah, start tuning into it.
I love that. You also mentioned this, practice of like identifying your own triggers, or like what are the things that are buttons that will make you feel either manipulated or taken advantage of, or just that general sense of unfairness, however you might name that. And I think there is a cultural expectation, or an expectation of professionalism to ignore those or to move past them, to power past them. But I think what you are sharing with us is to really lean into that. That advocating for yourself first means listening to yourself and your own reactions.
Exactly. Exactly.
That's great. That's great. I want to take a moment to see if we have any questions from the audience, things that you've heard, things you want to hear more about. Feel free, you could drop that in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand and go off mute and share with us. Yes, Karen.
I'm older, and what's amazing is that nothing has changed. I mean, you could have had this conversation 50 years ago. Nothing has changed. But there are a couple things that I think that you said were really, really worthwhile. One is, you know these feelings. Don't let it build into resentment. You've got to get it out. Otherwise, it's going to come out sideways. The other thing is that you have to weigh the consequences, and you really have to pick your battles carefully. You can't go after every battle. You just have to swallow it sometimes, like you did when you were working and they passed over you for the president's speech. So picking your battles, somebody gave me that advice one time, and that's great. You can't pick all the battles. And the other thing is that you mentioned professionally. So often we want to vent, and venting is not a good thing. It's when you really plan out how are you going to present to the person, in what setting are you going to present it to the person. The other person has ego and may not go along with it. And so you really have to be careful of the other person's ego if you're going to get, to where you want to be.
Yeah. Karen, those are all fantastic points, especially, I think that thing about picking your battles, you guys, everything can't be World War III, right? And so exactly that sort of, choose your battles carefully and make sure that they're meaningful enough to actually put in the effort to then do the next part of that, which is, again, have your sort of battle plan, and don't just go in all guns blazing and make accusations, because as Karen said, there are going to be egos involved, of course, yours as well as the other person's. And one thing I think that can really, really help is, this is sort of somewhat of a standard negotiating technique, but really understand, obviously, of course, what you're advocating for, but then what the other person's needs and wants are, and what you want to advocate for yourself or for someone else, how you can frame it in language that the other person you're making this ask of will respond to, right? So it's not just like, hey, give me a promotion because I've been here and I'm amazing and, I deserve it. But it's, hey, boss, I know that, in the company's sort of year plan, we've wanted to grow our business by 20%. Well, the work I've done, has measurably grown our business by X figures, and make it as concrete as possible. Speak their language, not your language, and you'll be far more convincing. And again, it doesn't mean you will always get a yes or you'll always get what you want. This is reality, but at least you've shown up for yourself as best as you can, as powerfully as you can. And then again, the more often you do it, you'll both get more comfortable with it, but you need to sort of, the more you do it, the more you will get a yes. And again, it won't necessarily be across the board, always at work, you'll get the yes, but it's like, in your entire life, if you're advocating for yourself in big and small ways, the more you do it, the more often that, you'll increase your hit rate is what I'm getting at. You need to just constantly be doing it so that you do increase your hit rate.
I love that.
Somebody once said also to me is that, and this is a phrase that really works, what's in it for them?
Yeah, exactly.
For example, you want promotion. Well, what's in it for your boss? Well, your boss is going to look good because you're going to do good work. So you always look what's in it for them. Yep.
That's great. That's really great. Thank you, Karen.
I love that. Thank you. And Nora, I want to get to your question in just a minute, but while we're on this topic of language, I see a question from Richard here. Can you speak to the importance of how to couch language when you're advocating for yourself? And some of the things I'm hearing clearly is one, practice. That advocating for yourself is learning to speak the language of the person you want to hear you. But if you have any other like stock language or go-to, like something I like to use personally is, how can we work together to find X? But anything else on language that you recommend?
Two things, actually. One is try as hard as you possibly can to take any emotional or charged language out of anything, especially if it's written, because then that will stay, that stays forever. But also, again, when you are practicing this this conversation that you're going to be having with whoever it is, maybe you're the type of person who needs to write it down, maybe you need to role play it, whatever it is that will help you practice. Just take out all of the charged and the emotional language, and also a lot of the accusatory language, that like, you did this, you did that. And it can get a little bit sort of awkward, because there are all of these things that say, oh well, you should often couch things as like I or we or whatever, and it's sometimes a bit awkward to always to totally avoid saying you in a conversation. But again, you want to take out any accusatory, any charged, any emotional language as much as possible. Make it concrete, make it about the facts, make it about things that you can prove or evidence you can point to, all that kind of stuff. And then, depending on the situation, another beautiful thing that you can do is just ask open-ended questions. So it's, again, depending on I'll give you a concrete example. So, last summer, in one of my businesses, we had to start renegotiating some of our contracts with partners that we've had for a really long time. And the way I tend to operate is like, oh, well, I'm going to go in with various options and solutions and then give them this list to choose from, right? And I remember I was working with, I have a coach, and I highly, highly recommend coaches. And I was working with my coach on just sort of, how can I sort of, do this in a way that's fair and open without being like making it an ultimatum, right? And the best advice that she gave me was, look, like, just ask lots of questions, because if you go to them with hey, these are options A, B, and C, it automatically closes down other possibilities. And also, if they come to you with a solution, they're going to be that much more, sort of receptive to actually implementing that solution. But also, they might come up with solutions that are better than the ones that you've come up with. So don't actually, have some things in the back of your mind as a backup, but make it open-ended and just say, hey, look, this is the situation. How can we work together? Because of, these are the things that have changed. These are some of the challenges that we're facing, and we want to work together and continue this relationship and this partnership. What are your thoughts? And then it's just a beginning of a longer conversation, and that can be creative and broad and expansive, instead of these are our options, you choose A or B, or we're done. So open-ended questions, sort of, again, like Linda said, how can we work together to come up with a solution, can often, be the best way forward.
That's great. That's a great example. I think underpinning this is also timing, which we can get into in a minute. But I want to hear from Nora your question, and then thank you. We have some great ones in the chat that we're also going to get to. But Nora.
All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you going into your experiences and kind of giving like actual life examples. I do have a couple of questions for you regarding when you were talking about how, for example, you really wanted to go and talk to the president. However, you weren't given that opportunity. And even after you kind of stood up for yourself and for your coworker, you were still kind of shut down from that. I am curious to know what kept you in your position at the time, and another step forward. When do you know that after advocating for yourself enough times, you need to kind of like take 2 steps back and essentially just leave the position?
Yeah. So the first question, I think the reason I stayed is because I loved the work and I loved the people. And I think the bigger picture of being able to contribute to, working on things that I cared about, sort of the sense of mission, the sense of purpose, all that kind of stuff. This was one thing, and I didn't want to use an overused phrase, throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So for me, there were still so many other compelling reasons to stay. If I had hated the job anyway and was looking around, and then this was like the last straw, then fair enough. But like, it wasn't. There were so many reasons keeping me there, and this, as huge of a sort of slight or an injustice as it was, and as it felt at the time, it wasn't a reason enough for me to want to leave. So that's sort of why I stayed, and I stayed for 6 years after that. So it wasn't even just like, I stayed for a year or whatever. And then to your second question about how many sort of setbacks and challenges or whatever before you finally decide to leave, that is such a I hate to say it, but it is such a personal choice. And it's and again, I think maybe Karen alluded to this earlier, but you have to sort of weigh all of the factors, right? And sometimes you just got to suck it up, because life isn't fair. We don't live and work in a meritocracy where, the best people always rise to the top and get promoted and all of that kind of stuff. And yeah, and the life just isn't always fair. So there's just acknowledging that and parking that. But if it's like a pattern of constant sort of, you being looked over and not being appreciated and being overworked and all of that kind of stuff, you have to decide when enough is enough. Like nobody else can tell you that. And sometimes, there are some other compelling reasons to stay for a little bit longer while you plan your exit route. I think too many people glorify this idea of like, giving people the finger and then, sort of packing up and getting out of there kind of thing. That's cool. But I also, I think it's important that we remember the practicalities of life and, not burning bridges, sort of making sure that if you do give somebody, your job the finger and decide to walk off, like you have savings that you can, live off of for a little while. Or again, if you are finding yourself constantly frustrated at work, and it is becoming a toxic environment for whatever reason, start planning your exit. Like start saving every single penny you can, so you have a bit of a war chest with which you can sort of support yourself while you look for your next thing. If you don't find it, start looking around, work with recruiters, all that kind of good stuff. But you have to decide when enough is enough. But like I said, before you make a precipitous decision, make sure you've laid the groundwork so that you have a soft as landing as possible.
Really
Thank you
helpful
so
advice.
much. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Sure,
Thank you. And I think we're seeing a lot of similar questions in the chat about like, when do you know, what are your own boundaries? And I think that's what you are saying, Rupal, is like, you need to know your own boundaries and check in with those frequently. And Sandra, great point. Like, is your plan B better? Step one, have a plan B. And two, that's part of weighing those decisions.
Definitely.
That's great. I think we answered the questions that were in the chat from Stefan and Omandra, but certainly if there's more nuanced things, please. Drop that in.
Yeah.
While we process that, great, Stefan, good, happy to hear it. Yeah, it sounds like, again, know your boundaries and have a plan B is a pretty solid life advice here. A question that I have, and we've heard a little bit through this, but I want to ask it explicitly. How does advocating for oneself look different depending on your career stage, if at all?
Oh, that's a very good question. And I'm not just saying that to stall for time. I actually don't think it is. I think perhaps the language you use might have to, in some instances, maybe be a bit more deferential or, sort of more laden with like the padding and all that kind of stuff. But I think, the whole process is exactly the same, sort of tuning into yourself, knowing your boundaries, knowing your red lines, knowing, sort of tuning into your body and how it's reacting to sort of various work or personal settings, and then practicing and sort of standing up and putting yourself what's in it for the other person. I think just something to be sensitive up to is not to know your place, but to make sure that you're using the appropriate language for where you're at. So it doesn't mean that you go in sort of on your hands and knees when you're talking to a boss if you're early stage in your career, but it does mean that you can't be as perhaps hard. You might have to soften the tone. You might have to make some of that annoying, like perhaps or maybe, all of those sort of hedging words, pepper it in your conversation. But no, I mean the process is exactly the same, and it's really it only looks different superficially, and I think sort of the language that you would choose to use. But always, of course, I mean the default is going to be that you're respectful regardless, but yeah, just sort of maybe slightly sort of a little bit less sort of in your face if you're if you're earlier on in your career.
Great, thanks. There's a practice that I do personally. I've done it for like interpersonal relationships and also for work, of just, I keep a list of ways or things that I need to feel valued. And so for me, this is part of, I have a very explicit list that I can revisit and I can edit, but so that I know for myself, what do I need? So that if I'm not getting it, I can advocate and I know what I need. What other practices, habits, any of that self-reflection work, I think that we've talked around, what other practices do you have to get at that piece?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that's really helpful for that I've done is really tuning into what I refer to as your backstory. So, like, spend maybe an hour, however long you need, maybe 90 minutes in a quiet place, distraction free journal or some writing utensil, laptop, whatever it is. And really just sort of reflect back on your entire life, personal and professional, and start thinking about the times where you felt unfairly overlooked, or were annoyed about something you didn't say or you didn't do, or all of those things. And I can imagine, depending on what stage you're at in your life, some of us, the list might be longer or shorter, but then really tune into like the history of it, and then start thinking about, okay, well, what are the recurring themes? Is it like when I felt undervalued, or is it when I felt constantly overlooked, or is it because I felt that there was some imbalance in this relationship, whether it was a power imbalance or a respect imbalance or whatever it is. For a lot of us, all of us are ingrained with a very strong sense of justice, right? Like we think unfair. Well, I mean, some people sort of more than others, but I think fairness is something that always comes up, and whenever like fairness can or unfairness can come in a lot of different ways. It can be financial, it can be emotional, it can be physical, it can be professional, all of these things. So sort of tune into, like I said, your backstory and those times where you felt like you weren't treated fairly and you didn't advocate and all of these things, and then start looking for the trends and the patterns that arise from it, and then again use that to then inform like what you can anticipate in the future with your career, with your relationships, with your family, etc. And I love the way you put it, Linda, as far as like making a list, because that's sort of the third step, right? Is to make a list of like, okay, well, this is sort of the dissection and analysis part. Like this is looking in the past and really digging deep into me and how I respond to different situations. Because of course, like what I would feel resentful or disrespected by, other people might not even notice, right? So this is like the analysis and digging into yourself part. And then the next part is to like sort of, make it very structured in like almost buckets of like what it was. And then turn it into something positive. It's like this, like you just said, is like, what do I need for me to feel respected and valued, and all of those kinds of things. So it's taking your actual experience and not just trying to sit down and be like, oh well, how would I feel really valued at work, right? You're not making it a theoretical exercise, you're basing it on actual life experience.
I love that. Data driven.
Yeah, exactly.
Mind your own experience. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
So we have a question, and I'm really, really grateful for this one because I think it has been implicit in a lot of what we've talked about, but I want to be explicit here and talk about some gender imbalance, some other types of power imbalances that we know we see frequently. So this exact question comes from someone who is a female executive on an all-male leadership team. She feels her ideas are often dismissed and then taken up by male counterparts. It feels like there's a clear gender discrepancy. What tips do you have for managing that unfortunately very common experience?
Yeah, that's an ugly one. And, one of the easiest things to do, if there is at least another woman on, and so I'll get to her question in a minute, but one of the things that can help is, even if there's another woman, in these sort of all male boards or all male exec teams or C-suites, whatever it is for women to echo each other. And so it's like you raise a point, and then you sort of the other woman in the room. It's sad that we have to go sort of get this sort of almost contrived about it, but that's the reality we live in. And the other woman sort of echoes it, so it almost amplifies. That's what it's called. It's called like the amplify, whatever. So amplify each other. Obviously, in this instance, she's the only woman in the room. And I think one thing that can help, and this is a bit of an experiment, there's not like any one sort of solution for all of this stuff. Sandra saying sort of a tag team approach, and that is sort of what I'm getting to, is before the board meeting, before you're in a room together and everybody's sort of has to sort of puff out their shoulders and be the most important and loud voice in the room, and there's a lot of grandstanding, I imagine. Before that happens, when there's slightly less ego involved and it's sort of not everybody in a room together, just try sort of connecting with folks one-on-one and maybe raising whatever point that you want to make in the meeting with them one-on-one. So if anybody else, for example, in the meeting echoes what you say and overlooks it, at least you've had that conversation with a few of them already, so they know that it was you. And then hopefully when you say it again in the meeting, it will just echo it and amplify it in a different way. So you don't have the other women in the room to amplify it, but you're effectively amplifying yourself. So is a really, really sort of easy, or not easy, but it's, sort of one way to address the fact that a lot of us, as you said, are going to be the only women in the room, or often the only person of color in the room, or the only many things, the only bi person, the only non-binary person. It's and it shouldn't matter, but it does. And I think that's one way of doing it. And then the other thing I was going to suggest is almost sort of like speak, and this takes a lot of work, so it's unfortunate that it has to just fall on you, given that there are however many 8 or 10 or whatever other people in the room. But again, that really speaking their language, what's in it for them. So if you know that there's one fellow board member who really cares about, I don't know, the financials of whatever you're talking about, speak his language to him, so at least he's paying attention. And it won't necessarily stop other people from echoing it, and perhaps you're not getting credit for it, but at least there's that connection directly with that person. So again, they're more likely to hear it because you're speaking their language. So it can get very tedious, depending on the size of your board, to have to do that on a one-on-one approach. But this is the reality we've been handed, ladies, and that we've got to work with what we're given. So I would say those are probably the 2 best ways of approaching it, and just experiment, see what happens. Maybe a hybrid approach would work. Just see what happens. And also perhaps, I'm a huge fan of just asking other women, if you know other women on boards, and I imagine most of us who do sit on boards will be the only woman in the room, what other techniques have they used? But those are two of the ones that I've used, with not perfect, like 100% track record, but at least it starts to chip away at it.
Great, thank you. And we have some great other recommendations in the chat, so I'll say this aloud so we can hear it. But certainly this tag team approach. We have a book recommendation for the book Feminist Fight Club. Love that name. Check that one out. Certainly this echoing and amplification, being able, if a man appropriates a woman's idea, having someone else be able to say, yes, I agree with her, insert name, this person, this point. Those are some really,
men can do it for you too, if you've got, a relatively sort of close friend or advocate on the board with you. So it doesn't just have to be women doing it for each other.
Yeah, and I want to touch on this point as well, of like how we've talked a lot about advocating for oneself, of what you can do individually, but obviously we know that networks and the people you bring in to support you is also a big piece of this. Can you talk about that, and perhaps strategically how you can align yourself or bring other people in to help you advocate for yourself?
So this is an easy one. Well, it's simple, but it's not necessarily easy. Just be so careful with your reputation. Like literally every touch point you have should be a positive one. Again, this doesn't mean that you're sort of handing out cookies and donuts to everybody to try to become best friends with them, but I'll give you a small example. A lot of the times if you work in a corporate setting, you might have like a receptionist or a secretary, and a lot of times people feel like there's some sort of a hierarchy and act superior and act sort of dismissive of the admin staff more often than not, and a lot of the times they are women, but oftentimes those people who we dismiss can be the gatekeepers to the more important decision makers. And so you're not just doing it so that you can manipulate those decision makers or whatever, but it's like, just be a decent person to everybody, like who you touch, not physically touch, who you touch in a work, in a professional setting. Like, be a person of your word, be someone that that people know they can rely on, be decent. It doesn't mean that you have to plaster a fake smile on your face, but be pleasant, be polite. These are simple things, you guys, but maybe you wouldn't be surprised at how uncommon it is, especially in sort of certain industries, because so in the agency we called it your hall file, right? And it was basically the reputation you developed, not just for how how good an analyst or how good a worker you were, but like, did people think you were a dick, or did people really like working with you, or did people, sorry for the language, by the way, but it shouldn't matter, but we don't live in a world of shoulds. We live in a world where people, again, egos get bruised, or people start talking about you, and then when it comes time for promotion, people, your managers might think, oh, but she's a bit abrasive, and people don't, or he's a bit, of an a-hole, and people don't really like working with him. You will get passed over for stuff like that. So make sure you've got as tight a hall file as you possibly can. Like I said, don't contrive and try to bribe people and bring in like cookies and donuts and coffee for everyone, but just be a good, decent human being and be a person of your word. Those two things, like I said, simple but not always, or straightforward and simple but not always easy or consistent, but this will create the hall file, and those hall files have echoes throughout your career. You would be surprised. There's that great quote, right? It's like, be careful about who you stand on your way to the top, or something. I can't remember, but it's something about like, you just never know when you're going to re-confront people that you might have been a total jerk to. So just don't be a jerk.
Excellent life advice. What a great takeaway. And yeah, just to underscore that piece, it's a lot easier to advocate for yourself when people want to listen and trust you.
Exactly.
That is a wonderful note. Thank you, everyone, so much for this lively chat and conversation. We will have a recording available and putting together a nice little one-pager of some of these top takeaways and things that we learned. So Rupal, thank you so much for this experience. Thank you for all the questions in the chat. Thanks for coming off mic, showing us your faces. I think this conversation was certainly more rich because everyone here participated. So thank you very much. And we will, again, send an email with the link for this recording and additional events. We hope you continue to join us in this UChicago learning. Thank you so much. And we do have a survey in the link. We'd love to hear your feedback so we can continue to make this as useful as possible for you all. Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Bye, ladies. Bye, everybody.
Bye.